Hi, I'm Micheal Poff with the Carter-Jenkins Center. In the last part 2 of this presentation, we saw how ever new versions of Bronislaw Malinowski's old critique of Freudian Oedipal theory continue to misrepresent that theory and to perpetuate what I call the fallacy of pathological patriarchy as the cause of the Oedipus complex. I've tried to show that this fallacy confuses the difference between what causes the Oedipus complex on the one hand and what complicates its resolution on the other hand. Malinowski epitomized this confusion in his curious prediction that the Oedipus complex would cease to exist in Western society as the father becomes more and more weak and henpecked, as he put it. In this final part 3, we'll look more closely at the problems with this old argument, and we'll look at what I consider to be the most interesting biological and evolutionary foundations of the Oedipus complex, as Freud theorized that, namely the prolonged dependency of the human child relative to the early onset of its sexual drive development. For most animals, sexual maturation is synchronous with complete physical growth and independence from the primary caregiver. But this isn't the case for humans. Over the course of human evolution, the rates of these two maturational or developmental lines, in Freudian theory, the id and the ego, became ever more decoupled and asynchronous. Comparatively speaking, sexual drive development in humans is precocious relative to physical growth and independence from caregivers. Oedipal theory reflects Freud's recognition of the psychological, social, and evolutionary implications of this feature of human biology. And it's this incongruity and asymmetry in our development and the conflicts arising from it, and not pathological patriarchy, that causes the Oedipus complex and makes it universal. Anyone interested in the full text of parts 1, 2, and 3 of this presentation can follow the link on the Carter-Jenkins Center's website to the article in the issue 2 of the International Journal of Controversial Discussions from 2020. And as always, thank you for your interest and thank you for visiting the Carter-Jenkins Center's website. The fallacy of pathological patriarchy and sociopolitical ideology. Psychoanalysts influenced by Marxist theories such as Reich in The Mass Psychology of Fascism from 1933 and The Sexual Revolution in 1936, or later Guattari in Anti-Oedipus from 1972, took up and amplified the more ideological and sociopolitical implications of Malinowski's thesis of pathological patriarchy. Perhaps the most controversial and tragic of these was Wilhelm Reich, who eventually pushed these elements to frankly psychotic extremes. In spite of the psychotic element in Reich's ideological views, however, his ultra-Malinowskian critique of patriarchy gained a great deal of followers. Quote, "Right up until the end, Reich had many disciples, including medical doctors and scientists." End quote. That was from Chassequet, Smergel, and Grunberger, 1986. Reich became fascinated with Malinowski's idealized portrayal of Trobriand sexuality and his ideas on patriarchy, repression, and totalitarianism. With his amalgam of Freudian and Marxist theories, Reich constructed a more explicitly political version of Malinowski's prediction of an extinct Oedipus complex. Quote, "The Oedipus complex must disappear in a socialist society, because its social basis, the patriarchal family, will itself disappear, having lost its raison d'etre." End quote. Reich seized upon Freud's earlier theory that anxiety results simply from undischarged quantities of libido and proceeded to reduce, quote, "all mental and physical illness to a single cause, sexual stasis," end quote. The mentally ill person is simply constrained by social prohibitions and is unable to abandon himself to orgasm to discharge sexual energy. Reich further insisted that, quote, the repression of genital tendencies is what provokes the eruption of brutality in history, end quote. That was also from Chasseguis, Mergel, and Grumberger. They describe this overriding theme in Reich's writings, quote, in all of Reich's work, we have a universal evil, sexual stasis, which is responsible for cancer, schizophrenia, and fascism, and its obverse in a universal panacea, orgasm, end quote. Now, probably it would be more accurate to say that patriarchy was the real evil for Reich and his followers, and that sexual stasis was merely its effect. As with Malinowski, the symptom may have been a sexual one, but the real problem was oppressive paternal authority. Exactly as Fromm and others would claim, Reich maintained that the Oedipus complex was only, quote, a result of the sexual restrictions imposed on the child by society. Yet wholly unconscious of what they're doing, the parents carry out the intentions of authoritarian society, end quote. The weaknesses of this argument for pathological patriarchy become clearer when we consider that it allows for no contribution whatsoever from normal maturation and development to the child's aggression, sexual competition, and ambivalent trends in the nuclear relationships. In one form or another, all reflect a perversion of power structured accordingly to external forces, encoded in repressive institutions, and implemented and reproduced by pathological parenting. This extreme cultural determinism is entirely inconsistent with the abundant examples of instinctually driven dominance hierarchies, sexual competition, and bisexual behavior among all of our closest primate relatives. Are we to believe that the instinctual sources of these behaviors were simply erased with human evolution? A common thread that runs from Malinowski through Reich to later publications like Anti-Oedipus and into contemporary psychoanalytic critiques is the claim that if the Oedipus complex is simply the consequence of culture and oppressive power, then the parents, and Freudian psychoanalysts, by the way, who reproduce Western society itself are the agents of that pathology. There are ever new examples within psychoanalysis of this old thesis. Here is a recent one. Quote, there is little doubt that the Oedipus complex is culture-specific and an essentially pathological outcome of a male-dominated, class-structured society. The destructive competition with other men produces distant, uncooperative, possibly non-constructive relationships and leads to erotic compulsions that prevent stable, intimate, sexually satisfying marriages alongside intimate, contextualized relationships with other women, end quote. That's from Bugra and Buey. These authors essentially paraphrase Malinowski's original conclusion and write that the Oedipus complex, quote, is not built into the collective mind but is found only under specific historical circumstances, such as societies with patriarchal authorization structures and competition for wealth that stimulate rivalry and hostility. And repeating Reich's objects of blame, the authors insist that parents, quote, as agents of such a social order who harbor hostile and erotic feelings for their children, bring the Oedipus complex into being where it may not exist, end quote. Specifically missing from this thesis is Freud's complemental series. With this formulation, Freud repeatedly and explicitly defined the reciprocal relation between innate biological and experiential environmental factors operating in the etiology of human motivations. For the same reason, it eliminates the weighing of both endogenous and exogenous contributions to bisexual conflicts and ambivalence in human psychosexuality.
These must all be pathological symptoms of oppressive power relations. Reich was explicit about this, maintaining that, quote, ambivalence in the sense of coexisting reactions of love and hatred is not a biological but a socially conditioned fact, end quote. Freud, of course, would have said that it's both. By definition, this argument also pathologizes the complete Oedipus complex, with its complementary heterosexual and homosexual dimensions. All of these essentially Freudian concepts are simply eliminated and replaced with the same old Malinowskian ideological equation of external patriarchal oppression. Freud was clear about his assessment of a utopian dimension in these socio-political critiques of Oedipal theory. This particular aspect of the polemic, namely the relation of individual psychology to power and political institutions, was always a part of the debates within and between both anthropology and psychoanalysis over the Oedipus complex. Within psychoanalytic circles alone, the relation of theoretical to political differences was complex. On the one hand, Micheal, himself a Marxist, disagreed with neo-Freudians like Gardner, Fromm, and Horney, who insisted that Oedipal theory represented a rigid biological determinism that was antithetical to the hope for a malleable human nature and perfectible society. Unlike Micheal, the neo-Freudians insisted that, quote, the insight into the formative power of social forces upon individual minds required changes in Freud's theory of instincts. On the other hand, Micheal's ideological perspective, while less revolutionary than Reich's, required a level of optimism for humanity that Freud considered to be unrealistic. He believed that, quote, wars, misery, and neurosis, end quote, could one day be fully eliminated with a, quote, more reasonable and less contradictory regulation of social relations, end quote. Freud was far more pessimistic about the benefits of state-regulated social relations and the future of mankind. Freud explained his view of utopian plans to rid mankind of its violent tendencies in a famous letter to Albert Einstein, published in Why War from 1933. The following passage is especially relevant to the present discussion because while Freud is writing explicitly about the utopian element in critiques of his anthropological theory, he's implicitly referring to Malinowski's Trobriand matrilineal thesis. Quote, there is no use in trying to get rid of men's aggressive inclinations, Freud says. We are told that in certain happy regions of the earth, where nature provides in abundance everything that man requires, there are races whose life is passed in tranquility and who know neither coercion nor aggression. I can scarcely believe it, and I should be glad to hear more of these fortunate beings. The Russian communists, too, hope to be able to cause human aggressiveness to disappear by guaranteeing the satisfaction of all material needs and by establishing equality in other respects among all the members of the community. That, in my opinion, is an illusion, end quote. What really causes the Oedipus complex? Apart from its utopian implications, perhaps the greatest weakness of the pathological patriarchy critique is that it fails to account for what is possibly one of the most significant and underappreciated features of human evolutionary biology, one which was always at the heart of Freud's Oedipal theory. The likely consequences of this feature for individual psychology and human society go virtually unnoticed in critiques of Oedipal theory, in spite of their central role in the development of that theory by Freud. Specifically, Freud maintained that what sets the central Oedipal conflicts in motion is neither exclusively externally motivated, nor is it primarily aggression, paternal or otherwise. Rather, it's the prolonged duration of childhood helplessness and dependency, as this gradually becomes inflected through the prism of the distinctly precocious sexual maturation that characterizes our species. In Freud's own words, quote, "The Oedipus complex is the cyclical correlate of two fundamental biological facts: the long period of the child's dependence and the remarkable way in which its sexual life reaches a first climax in the 3rd to 5th years of life." To better understand this feature of Freud's anthropological thinking, we can turn to Gabriele Rohan, the first psychoanalyst anthropologist, and arguably the most eloquent interpreter of this aspect of Freudian theory. Rohan elaborated on the congruence between Freud's formulations and the fetalization theory of Dutch anatomist Louis Bolk. Rohan quotes Bolk, quote, "There is no mammal that grows so slowly as man, and not one in which the full development is attained at such a long interval after birth. What is essential in man as an organism? The obvious answer is the slow progress of his life's course. This slow tempo is the result of a retardation that has gradually come about in the course of ages." End quote. In the course of hominin evolution, individual psychical development has been marked by a progressive retardation or slowing of its rate. Following Rohan's description of this, humans in particular achieve physical maturation, quote, "far more slowly than any other mammal. Most mammals are mature at 1 year or less. A chimpanzee is mature at about 7 years, a human being at about 15 or more, though growth is not complete until over 20 years, and the skull sutures remain open until nearly 30 so that the brain can still grow." End quote. The maturation being referred to here would include that of the ego of Freudian structural theory, and all of what Hartmann referred to as inborn ego apparatuses, and the structures of the conflict-free sphere of the ego, such as perception, motility, memory, and the physical structures of the body on which they depend. Hartmann, Criss, and Lowenstein from 1951 underscored the importance of Rohan's observations on the significance of the retarded development of these structures in humans. Quote, "It implies the idea not only of the unique role of the love object in human development, but also the extent to which the influence of this object determines later behavior." End quote. A corollary of this evolutionary slowing of somatic development, or neoteny, is the progressive fetalization of adult human features relative to our primate relatives and our hominin ancestors. According to Rohan, quote, "Human beings have conserved traits in the anatomical structure which makes them comparable to juvenile or fetal anthropoids." End quote. As a result, quote, "We are much more like baby monkeys than adult ones." End quote. He's referring to our appearance. This remarkable fact can be seen in adult human features such as flattened face, upright posture, roundness of the skull, and brain size relative to the body, all of which more closely resemble those of the infant chimpanzee, who will eventually outgrow them. We never do. Rohan's synthesis shows that Freud's observations on the evolutionary significance of delayed development remain perfectly consistent with contemporary evolutionary biology. Stephen Jay Gould referred to this pedomorphic theory of human origins, whereby humans evolved by retaining the juvenile features of our ancestors. He judged that this neotness, slowing down of human development, and the corollary retention of juvenile traits, quote, has been probably the major determinant of human evolution, end quote. The selective advantage of this process is evident in the fact that it allows for the retention into later development of the rapid brain growth rates of the fetus, longer learning and socialization, greater complexity in social behavior, and more adaptive flexibility due to less overspecialized traits. On the asynchrony between the ego and the id. The particular relevance of this to the Oedipus complex becomes clear when we compare the slowed rate of ego development in humans to our separate rate of sexual drive development. Over the course of human evolution, the rates of these two maturational or developmental lines have become ever more decoupled, divergent, and asynchronous. The final adult growth of the ego lags far behind its sexual drive counterparts. Whereas in general, among most species, sexual development is synchronous with completed physical growth, this is not the case for humans. In Rohan's description, quote, "The incidence of the sexual impulse is premature. Man is not only slowed down when compared to the animal world, but presents a disharmony in his own rate of development," end quote. The consequence of this is that, quote, "within the frame of our general retardation," speaking of the ego, "our sexuality is relatively precocious," speaking of the id, end quote. Rohan observed that the, quote, "enormous discrepancy in the age of sexual maturity and full growth is striking when we compare man to other animals," end quote. This holds true even for our closest primate relatives, who in turn display the same asynchrony more so than all other mammals except humans. A remarkable example of this precocious genitality in other primates can be seen among the bonobo chimpanzees, a species possibly most similar to our pre-human ancestor. Among the bonobos, genital arousal and stimulation in a variety of modes is utilized nearly indiscriminately, including by juveniles and between the young and adults, as a means of modulating aggression, dissipating conflicts, food bartering, and other social purposes. Though not as great as in humans, the asynchronous relationship between sexual development and full physical growth is still quite marked. Wild females give birth for the first time at 13 or 14 years of age, becoming full grown by about 15, end quote. That was from DeWall in 2006. Asynchrony and the ego's defenses. Rohan elaborated on Freud's view of the significance of this asynchrony for object relations in childhood, noting that, quote, "since genital libido is present at the time when the child is still dependent, the prima facie sex object must be the mother," end quote. Intrapsychic conflicts result from the mismatch between the child's object-related libidinal fantasies and the ability to fully satisfy them in reality. Depending on a multitude of potentially ameliorating or exacerbating internal and external factors, again in accordance with Freud's complemental series, these conflicts can result in nothing more than the stage-typical transient nightmares and fears of monsters under the bed. Conversely, the conflicts can develop into paralyzing and unresolvable symptoms, such as chronic phobias or crippling inhibitions later in adult relationships. Along with the evolution of this asynchronous differentiation between ego and id, humans have co-evolved psychological mechanisms of defense, such as projection, repression, sublimation, and introjection, in order to protect the immature ego from being overwhelmed by the precocious drives while the child is still dependent upon the mother and figure. According to Rohan, quote, "the psyche has to evolve various mechanisms to repress or project or transform the sexual impulse." Sociocultural implications. Now, I've followed Rohan extensively here in order to clarify Freud's underappreciated formulation that the Oedipus complex is the cyclical correlate of two fundamental biological facts: the long period of the human child's dependence and the remarkable way in which its sexual life reaches a first climax in the 3rd to 5th years of life. Oedipal theory reflects Freud's recognition of the psychological, social, and evolutionary implications of this developmental asynchrony. It is this incongruity and the developmental conflicts arising from it, and not paternal aggression, that causes the Oedipus complex and makes it universal. These considerations serve to further clarify the problem with Malinowski's prediction that the Oedipus complex would become extinct with the weak and henpecked father. It assumed that if the average father figure of a given society were benign or even psychologically castrated, then the motivation for jealous hostility toward the father due to sexual competition for the mother's sole affections would be eliminated. As we've seen, even logically this makes no sense. The arousal of such hostility requires nothing more aggressive or violent than the Oedipal child's nightly exclusion from the parent's bedroom, to say nothing of the total extrusion of the child from the mother's entire village at weaning and again at puberty, as in the Trobriand case. In fact, Malinowski had it exactly backwards. Whereas the weak and henpecked father figure would have little bearing on the actual cause of the Oedipus complex, he would most certainly play a role in its course, intensity, and likelihood of remaining unresolved. As discussed earlier with regard to Oedipal victories and defeats, the same would be true in the case of a tyrannical and abusive father. In fact, Freudian theory implicates both extremes of overstimulation or indulgence on the one hand, and excessive frustration, violence, or trauma on the other, in the wide range of problems that can interfere with a successful resolution of the Oedipus complex. Both extremes can be associated with complications leading to Oedipal and pre-Oedipal fixation or regression in development. Likewise, both can interfere with latency, and for this reason, an adequate consolidation of sexual role identifications and conscience formation going into puberty. Spiro demonstrated this for the Trobriand boy, who, so far from having no Oedipus complex, retained the unresolved libidinal attachments to the pre-Oedipal and Oedipal mothering object even more intensely than is likely for the Western boy. In Trobriand society, the total extrusion from the mother and her village at the time of weaning, and again at puberty, were necessary precisely in order to facilitate the young boy's identification with his collective fathers, and the relinquishing of the still powerful earlier attachment to the Oedipal and pre-Oedipal maternal objects. Prolonged dependency and the human family. Freud's recognition of the consequences of prolonged human maturation and dependency provided him with a conceptual link between individual and social psychology and phylogenetic processes. Freud realized that it was because of this feature in the mother-infant relationship that, quote, the influence of the real external world upon the developing infant is intensified, end quote. It was this factor that, quote, establishes the earliest situations of danger and creates the need to be loved which will accompany the child through the rest of its life, end quote. The implications of this for the evolution of social structures was not lost on Freud. Quote, in the prolonged symbiosis of the child with his parents, we have the reason why human beings live in families, and in this prolonged coexistence of two generations, we have the biological basis of social life, end quote. It was on this conceptual foundation that Freud formulated his theory of human culture as a compromise solution to the dynamic conflicts forever arising between the ego and the drives. Quote, and here the discovery was made that a third and extremely serious part of human intellectual activity, the part which has created the great institutions of religion, law, ethics, and all forms of civic life, has as its fundamental aim of the enabling of the individual to master his Oedipus complex and to divert his libido from its infantile attachments onto the social ones that are ultimately desired, end quote. The genius of Freud's theoretical integration of individual psychology, social psychology, and evolutionary processes brings us to a final irony. It was because of Freud's grounding in evolutionary biology that critics, ever since Malinowski, have continued to accuse him of postulating a rigid biological determinism or reductionism. Yet nowhere is Freud's insistence on the reciprocal interaction of biological inheritance and developmental experience in human adaptation more elegantly on display than when Freud defined the Oedipus complex in relation to the biological fact of prolonged infant dependency. As we have seen, Freud recognized that it was precisely for this reason that, quote, an early differentiation between the ego and the id is promoted, end quote. A major consequence of this differentiation that's promoted is the fact that anywhere between 12 and 20 plus years of enculturation, depending on the given society, will be required of the human ego before it can master the simultaneous demands made upon it from both the external environment and the internal drives sufficiently to achieve adult status. It is this distinctive feature of our shared evolutionary heritage and developmental biology that ensures from the beginning to the end of life the role of learning, culture, and adaptation in all human motivation. And it's this differentiation between the ego and the id, and the normal developmental conflicts arising from it, that causes the Oedipus complex and makes it universal. To summarize and conclude, I've stressed the fact that prolonged childhood helplessness and dependency is a cross-cultural universal. It's a function of our shared evolutionary heritage as a species. Equally cross-cultural is the fact that roughly between 2 to 5 years of age, long before physical maturity and independence is attained, libidinal attachment to the primary caregivers will become inflected through the prism of genitally dominated, object-related impulses, perceptions, and fantasies. The dawning recognition at this unique moment in development, quote, that the young baby and its mother are not alone in the world, and that the object has its own object, which is not the baby, triggers, end quote, that's a quote from Green, triggers an inevitable and more or less painful narcissistic crisis. The normal set of developmental conflicts that flows from this crisis is what Freud called the Oedipus complex. The achievement among our proto-human ancestors of a means of resolving this Oedipus complex was in Freud's estimation as monumental an event for human evolution as it is for each person's individual development. It's only too easy to forget that Freud's most controversial conclusion in Totem and Taboo was not that all children experience destructive and incestuous wishes in the Oedipal triangle, or even that the primal deed, either fantasized or real, had occurred. Rather, it was Freud's assertion that the distinctly human means of resolving the Oedipus complex, in both its intrapsychic and cultural dimensions, recapitulates primal adaptations made and preserved by some as yet incompletely understood mechanisms of inheritance. A central theme of this discussion has been that Freud's explanation of this human innovation can only be appreciated in the context of his ideological formula of the reciprocal interaction of innate and acquired factors operating in human ontogeny and phylogeny, otherwise known as Freud's complemental series. Finally, as Oedipal conflicts must be accounted for regardless of society or culture, they must also be accounted for regardless of sex. Much has been written and debated concerning the profound and important differences between the female and male Oedipus complexes. I would argue that these differences were always the more important and fruitful subject for psychoanalysis to grapple with, far more than the question of a non-Oedipal nuclear complex. It certainly was for Freud. He grappled a great deal with this question, and he altered his theory over time to account for it. He also acknowledged his limitations with regard to this subject and recognized the necessary role of women psychoanalysts in answering it. For better or worse, however, the historic controversy that emerged between anthropology and psychoanalysis was not about these differences, nor was it about their profound effects in the adult lives of women and men. The crux of the controversy, rather, was the question of whether or not the Oedipus complex existed, and specifically whether it existed in non-Western matrilineal societies. Malinowski's answer was no, even though he agreed that Freud's Oedipal theory was an accurate analysis of the European or Western-type nuclear complex. To this extent, Malinowski's own thesis remains at odds with the more radical rejections of Oedipal theory in contemporary psychoanalysis and the postmodern rejection of nomothetic or generalizable models altogether. I've tried to demonstrate some of the weaknesses of these trends in psychoanalysis and their historical connections with Malinowski's sex and repression in savage society. The guiding assumption here has been that an understanding of the evolutionary bases for Oedipal conflicts serves the question of their different manifestations according to sex and a multitude of other variables. Radical versions of cultural determinism would preempt this complemental approach with the claim that sexual differences are purely cultural constructions. Equally extreme versions of biological determinism would also preempt it and the possibility of a psychoanalytically informed critical theory, one which takes into account the role of environmental forces in structuring apperception. By definition, both extremes effectively eliminate Freud's etiological formula of the complemental series. For the same reason, both preempt a balanced understanding of the cross-culturally variable but universally recognized boundaries that differentiate the generations, adult from child, and the sexes, male from female. The social structuring of these boundaries, along with those defining exogamous groups, is the collective equivalent of the resolution of the Oedipus complex. Paradoxically, while it was Freud who insisted on the biological fact of the duality of the sexes, it was also Freud who confronted our simplistic assumptions about these boundaries, asserting that, quote, no individual is limited to the modes of reaction of a single sex, end quote, and that the psychological bisexuality, too, embarrasses all our inquiries into the subject and makes them harder to describe. That was also a quote of Freud's. And while it took Freud to elucidate the nature of the unconscious forces that drive our creative capacity to transcend boundaries, it was also Freud who described the power of those same forces to undo the boundaries upon which our creativity and culture thrive. While variously drawn, these universal boundaries are the very ones to which human beings must become reconciled in the course of resolving the Oedipus complex and mastering the challenges of life and adult love. Unfortunately, this comes as a painful blow to human narcissism and to our childhood fantasies of omnipotence in the course of early development. For this reason, the fragile ego is always ready with new resistances to the recognition and acceptance of these universal boundaries. It's a tribute to the power of such resistances that from within anthropology, Kluckhohn, from 1951, would affirm the existence of a universal cultural pattern and would consider this statement to be a confession, as though he had told an embarrassing secret. It remains a great irony that 70 years later, and a century after Freud's Totem and Taboo, this universal culture pattern is still being treated like an embarrassing secret within psychoanalysis.